I watched my grandson Kevin slam the gavel down on the podium, his voice echoing through my living room like a death sentence. And that concludes Grandma's junk sale, folks. Thanks for coming out to help clear out all this old garbage. The crowd of bargain hunters laughed along with him, loading their cars with pieces of my life they'd bought for pocket change. My hands trembled as I gripped the kitchen door frame, hidden from view, watching strangers cart away 47 years of memories. Then I saw him, the silver-haired man in the expensive suit standing near my grandmother's writing desk, the one item Kevin hadn't managed to sell. The man caught my eye and gave me the smallest nod, and I knew in that instant that my grandson's cruelty was about to cost him everything he thought he'd won. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Castellano, and I turned 73 last April in a hospital bed recovering from pneumonia. That's when my grandson Kevin decided I was too old, too sick, and too much of a burden to keep living in my own home. The home his grandfather Vincent and I had bought in 1976 with every penny we'd saved from running our small Italian restaurant in Boston's North End. The home where we'd raised Kevin's father Marco before cancer took Vincent 12 years ago. The home that held every precious thing I owned, every memory of a life well lived. Kevin had always been charming in that dangerous way that lets people get away with almost anything. Tall and handsome like his grandfather, with that same easy smile that made you want to trust him even when your instincts screamed otherwise. His mother, my daughter-in-law Rachel, had divorced Marco 8 years ago and moved to California, leaving Kevin to bounce between his father's apartment and my house. I tried to be there for the boy, tried to fill some of the gaps his absent mother had left. I'd paid for his college tuition when Marco's construction business hit hard times. I'd co-signed for his first car. I'd even let him move into my spare bedroom last year when he claimed he needed time to save money for his own place. What I didn't know was that Kevin had been systematically planning to take everything from me for months. While I'd been in the hospital fighting for breath, convinced I might not make it home again, my grandson had been consulting with lawyers about having me declared incompetent. He'd been photographing my house, making lists of everything I owned, and reaching out to estate sale companies about liquidating my assets. The pneumonia had hit me hard last March. One week I was volunteering at the church food pantry and tending my garden. The next I was sedated in intensive care with tubes down my throat. The doctors said it was touch and go for a while, that my age and a weakened immune system had made the infection particularly vicious. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital, another 2 in a rehabilitation facility learning to walk again without getting winded. When I finally came home in late April, weak but grateful to be alive, I found Kevin waiting with papers for me to sign. "It's just temporary, Grandma," he'd said, his smile warm and reassuring as he spread documents across my kitchen table. The same table where Vincent and I had eaten thousands of meals, where we'd done the restaurant's bookkeeping late into the night, where we'd celebrated every family milestone. "Just until you get your strength back. The doctor said you need help managing things right now, and I want to make sure all your affairs are in order in case, something happens." I should have read those papers more carefully. I should have called my own lawyer, my friend Patricia's son who'd handled Vincent's estate. But I was so tired, so grateful to be home, so touched that Kevin seemed to care about my well-being. I signed where he pointed, trusting that my grandson had my best interests at heart. That signature gave him power of attorney over my financial affairs. Within a week, he transferred my savings into accounts I couldn't access. He'd contacted Social Security about redirecting my checks. He'd even called my insurance company claiming he needed to manage my policies. And when I started asking questions, started realizing that something was very wrong, Kevin's mask began to slip. "You're not thinking clearly, Grandma," he'd say whenever I questioned his decisions. "The pneumonia affected your cognition. The doctors mentioned it, remember? You're confused about things. That's why I need to handle this stuff for you." But I wasn't confused. My mind was sharp even if my body was still recovering. I knew exactly what was happening, I just couldn't prove it. Kevin had been clever about covering his tracks, using my illness and age as weapons to make me doubt my own perceptions. When I tried to call the bank, he'd already informed them that I was experiencing cognitive difficulties, and that all inquiries should go through him as my legal representative. When I tried to access my online accounts, The passwords had been changed. I was being systematically cut off from my own life. The worst part was watching him move through my house like he already owned it, commenting on which furniture was worth keeping and which pieces were just taking up space. He'd bring people by without warning, real estate agents and appraisers who'd walk through my rooms making notes while I sat helpless in my favorite chair, feeling like a ghost in my own home. "The housing market is really hot right now, Grandma," Kevin said one evening in early June, leaning against the kitchen counter with a casualness that made my blood run cold. "This place could sell for over $1 million easy. Then we could get you into a really nice assisted living facility, somewhere with nurses and activities, where you'd be taken care of properly." "This is my home," I'd said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Your grandfather and I built our life here. I'm not leaving." Kevin's expression had hardened then, revealing the calculating stranger beneath the grandson I thought I knew. "You might not have a choice, Grandma. Your health is declining. You can't manage this big house on your own. And honestly, it's selfish to sit on all this equity when you could be somewhere safe while the money gets put to better use." Better use meaning Kevin's use, of course. I'd seen the way he'd been living since taking control of my finances. New clothes, expensive dinners, a flashy watch that cost more than Vincent and I used to make in a month at the restaurant. My money was funding his lifestyle while he convinced himself and everyone else that he was being a devoted, concerned grandson. That's when I started keeping a journal, writing down everything Kevin said and did, every conversation, every suspicious transaction I could piece together. I hid it in the old coffee tin in the back of my pantry, the one place I knew Kevin would never look because he'd always been too good for my homemade espresso. If something happened to me, if Kevin succeeded in having me committed or worse, I wanted there to be a record of the truth. But Kevin moved faster than I anticipated. In mid-June, he announced that he'd scheduled an estate sale for the first weekend in July. "Just clearing out some of the clutter, Grandma," he'd said, but I'd seen the extensive list he'd made. My grandmother's writing desk from Naples, Vincent's collection of vintage Italian cookbooks, the hand-painted dishes we'd brought back from our one trip to Sicily, the carved wooden crucifix that had hung in our restaurant for 30 years, even my wedding dress, carefully preserved in its box in the upstairs closet. "You can't sell those things," I protested, my voice shaking with anger and fear. "Those aren't yours to sell. Actually, Grandma, as your legal representative, I have every right to liquidate assets to ensure you're properly cared for. And let's be honest, most of this stuff is junk. Old furniture, outdated clothes, knickknacks nobody wants. We'll make a few $1,000s, clear out the house, and it'll be so much easier to manage. A few $1,000s for a lifetime of treasures. That's what my grandson thought my history was worth." I tried calling Marco, tried to tell my son what Kevin was doing, but they'd had some falling out over money Kevin owed him. Marco wasn't taking his calls, and Kevin had made sure I didn't have Marco's new number after he'd moved to a different apartment. I was isolated, trapped, and running out of time. The night before the estate sale, I barely slept. I lay in the bedroom I'd shared with Vincent for 41 years, staring at the ceiling and remembering. I remembered Vincent carrying me over the threshold when we'd first bought this house, both of us giddy with the impossibility of being homeowners. I remembered painting Marco's nursery that soft yellow color, Vincent's hand over mine on the brush. I remembered Sunday dinners with the whole extended family crowded around our table, my mother-in-law teaching me her secret recipes in this very kitchen. I remembered slow dancing with Vincent in the living room on our 40th anniversary, his arms still strong around me even as the cancer was beginning to take hold. This house was more than walls and furniture. It was the physical embodiment of love, sacrifice, and family. And my grandson was going to sell it all to strangers for whatever he could get, reducing my entire existence to a junk sale. The morning of the sale, I'd intended to leave. I couldn't bear to watch Kevin turn my life into a flea market. But my body betrayed me. A dizzy spell hit me as I was getting dressed, the lingering effects of my illness making the room spin. By the time I'd steadied myself, cars were already pulling up outside, and Kevin was setting up tables in my living room, pricing my possessions with little orange stickers like I was already dead. I'd retreated to the kitchen, making myself small and invisible, listening to my grandson's voice boom through the house. "Everything must go, folks. Make me an offer. We're clearing out the whole place." People I'd never seen before wandered through my home with proprietary interest, picking up my things, commenting on their condition, haggling over prices. I watched a young couple debate whether my good china was worth $15. I saw a middle-aged man walk away with Vincent's toolbox, the one he'd used to build the garden arbor that still stood in the backyard. I witnessed my entire life being dismantled piece by piece while Kevin collected cash and laughed with customers about what great deals they were getting on Grandma's old junk. The only thing that didn't sell was my grandmother's writing desk. It stood in the corner of the living room, intricately carved walnut wood that had been in my family for 4 generations. My grandmother Lucia had brought it from Italy in 1923, one of the few possessions she'd managed to bring to America. She'd written letters home on that desk, kept her household accounts, recorded family recipes in her careful handwriting.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
My mother had used it, then I had, documenting years of my life in its drawers and cubbies. I'd imagined passing it on to Marco, then perhaps to Kevin's children someday. A link in the chain of family history. Kevin had priced it at $300, which was insulting beyond measure. But even the bargain hunters seemed to sense that the desk was something special, something that shouldn't be casually carted away. It remained untouched throughout the morning, and I'd sent up a silent prayer of gratitude that at least this one treasure might be spared. That's when I first noticed the silver-haired man. He'd arrived late, after most of the crowd had already picked through the best items. He moved differently than the other shoppers, with purpose rather than the frantic energy of people hunting for deals. He was probably in his late 60s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that whispered money and taste. He didn't touch anything, didn't pick up items to examine them. He just observed, watching Kevin work the crowd with his false charm, watching people leave with their purchases, watching me through the kitchen doorway even though I'd thought I was hidden. When Kevin finally called out that the sale was ending, announcing his crack about Grandma's junk sale, that made everyone laugh at my expense, the silver-haired man approached the writing desk. Kevin noticed him for the first time, and I saw my grandson's expression shift into his practice sales mode. "Ah, you've got good taste, sir," Kevin said, walking over with his clipboard and cash box. "That's a genuine antique, came from Italy. I'm asking $300, but for you, since you're helping me clear out all this old stuff, I could do $250. The man didn't respond immediately. He ran his hand along the desk's surface with a reverence that made my heart ache. He opened the small drawers, examined the carved details, even looked underneath at the joinery work. Kevin shifted impatiently, clearly ready to be done with the whole exhausting day of selling off my life. "I'll give you $500, the man finally said, his voice cultured and measured. Kevin's eyes lit up with greed. "Sold. Let me just write you a receipt." "Actually," the man said, pulling out his phone, "I'd like to have this appraised before I take it. Would you mind if I brought someone by tomorrow to examine it? I collect antique furniture, and if this piece is authentic Italian 18th century work as I suspect, it could be quite valuable." I felt my pulse quicken. Valuable? I'd always known the desk was special, had always treated it with the care it deserved, but I'd never had it professionally valued. It was family history, not a commodity. Kevin's smile tightened. "Sure, no problem. But the sale is final. $500 cash, you take it today, or someone else might grab it." The man's expression remained pleasant, but something steely entered his eyes. "I don't think anyone else will grab it, Kevin. In fact, I don't think you should be selling it at all. Or anything else in this house." The shift in atmosphere was palpable. Kevin's smile froze. "Excuse me? Who are you?" "My name is Richard Thornhill," the man said, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a business card. "I'm an attorney specializing in elder law and estate fraud. And I'm here because your grandmother called me 3 weeks ago." The kitchen floor seemed to tilt under my feet. Called him? I hadn't called anyone except Patricia, my friend from church, pouring out my fears about what Kevin was doing. Patricia had listened with increasing alarm, then told me she knew someone who might be able to help. She'd said she would make some calls, but I'd heard nothing back and assumed it had led nowhere. I'd had no idea she'd actually reached out to a lawyer on my behalf. Kevin's face had gone from surprise to furious in seconds. My grandmother doesn't even have access to a phone. She's not mentally competent to make legal decisions. I have power of attorney. A power of attorney obtained under false pretenses from a woman who was recovering from serious illness, Richard Thornhill replied calmly. A power of attorney that you've been using not to protect your grandmother's interests as required by law, but to systematically steal from her. That makes it fraud, Kevin. Criminal fraud. My grandson's hands clenched into fists. The charming mask had completely fallen away, revealing the calculating predator underneath. You don't know what you're talking about. Everything I've done has been to take care of her. She's old, she's sick, she can't manage her own affairs. Dorothy, Richard called out, looking directly at me through the kitchen doorway. Would you please join us? I stepped out of my hiding place on shaking legs, gripping the doorframe for support. Kevin's expression when he saw me was a mixture of rage and something that looked almost like fear. Good. Let him feel a fraction of the fear he'd put me through. Mrs. Castellano, Richard said gently, are you mentally competent to manage your own affairs? Yes, I said, my voice stronger than I'd heard it in months. I've been competent the entire time. My grandson has been lying to everyone, using my illness to steal from me and sell my possessions without my consent. That's not true, Kevin sputtered, but his protest sounded hollow even to him. Grandma, you're confused. You signed the papers. You agreed to let me help you. I signed papers I thought were temporary medical directives, I replied, feeling strength flowing back into my spine with every word. I never agreed to let you take over my finances. I never agreed to let you sell my house or my possessions. I never agreed to be treated like I was already dead. Richard opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with documents. I've been investigating Kevin's activities for the past 2 weeks, he said. I have documentation of unauthorized transfers from Mrs. Castellano's accounts. I have records of Kevin accessing her Social Security benefits for his own use. I have witness statements from bank employees who were uncomfortable with his explanations, but felt they had to defer to the power of attorney. And I have a video recording from your friend Patricia, Mrs. Castellano, where you describe in detail the coercion and manipulation you've experienced. Kevin's face had gone pale. You're bluffing. You can't prove any of that. Actually, I can prove all of it, including this estate sale, which represents the unauthorized sale of property belonging to Dorothy Castellano without her knowledge or consent. Every person who bought something here today purchased stolen goods. They'll all need to be contacted and the items returned. This is insane, Kevin said, his voice rising. I'm her grandson. I was taking care of her. She would have lost everything if I hadn't stepped in. You were stealing from a vulnerable elderly woman, Richard corrected. You were exploiting her illness for financial gain. And you were preparing to sell her home and institutionalize her against her will so you could access the proceeds. That's not caregiving, Kevin. That's elder abuse. The words hung in the air between us, sharp and undeniable. Elder abuse. That's what my grandson had been doing to me. The boy I'd helped raise, the child I'd loved and supported and believed in, had been systematically abusing me for money. Grandma, Kevin said, his voice suddenly desperate, the charming mask trying to reassemble itself. Grandma, please. You know I love you. I was trying to help. We can work this out, we're family. But I looked at him and saw a stranger. The grandson I'd thought I knew had never really existed, or if he had, he'd been replaced by this grasping, cruel imposter who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to what he felt entitled to inherit. No, I said quietly. Family doesn't do what you've done, Kevin. Family doesn't sell someone's life away while they're still living it. Family doesn't call someone's treasures junk. Family doesn't treat the people who loved them like burdens to be disposed of. Richard Thornhill pulled out another document. Kevin Castellano, I'm serving you with notice that the power of attorney you obtained has been revoked effective immediately. All assets and accounts will be returned to Mrs. Castellano's control within 48 hours. Any attempt to access her finances or property will be considered theft and prosecuted accordingly. Additionally, Mrs. Castellano is filing for a restraining order that will prohibit you from entering her property or contacting her directly. You can't do this, Kevin whispered, but he knew it was over. I could see it in his eyes, the realization that his scheme had collapsed and the consequences were coming. Actually, we can, Richard replied. And we are. You have 1 hour to remove your personal belongings from this house. Anything belonging to your grandmother stays here. And Kevin, I'd strongly advise you to return every penny you've taken. Because if you don't, elder abuse charges will be filed with the district attorney's office, and you'll be facing criminal prosecution along with civil lawsuits. My grandson looked at me one last time, and I saw no remorse in his eyes, only anger at being caught. He grabbed his jacket from the back of a chair and walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. You're making a mistake, Grandma. You need someone to take care of you. You're going to end up alone, sick, with nobody to help you. And then you'll wish you'd let me handle things. I'd rather be alone than betrayed by someone I trusted, I said. Now get out of my house. He left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. In the silence that followed, I felt something break open inside me. Like ice that had frozen around my heart was finally cracking. I sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had just happened. Richard Thornhill sat down across from me, his expression kind but serious. Mrs. Castellano, I know this has been traumatic, but there's something else you need to know about that writing desk. I looked up at him through tears. I hadn't realized I was crying. What about it? He smiled, and it transformed his austere face into something warm and genuine. I told your grandson I collect antique furniture, and that's true. But what I didn't mention is that I also authenticate pieces for major auction houses. Your grandmother's desk isn't just a nice antique, Dorothy. It's a documented piece made by a master craftsman named Giuseppe Maggiolini in 1785. There are only 47 known pieces of his work still in existence. The room seemed to tilt again. What does that mean? It means your grandson was about to sell a museum-quality piece of Italian neoclassical furniture for $300. A piece that's worth, at current market value, approximately $2 million. I stared at him, unable to process what he'd just said. $2 million? For my grandmother's desk? The piece of furniture I'd polished every week, used to write letters and pay bills, the simple family heirloom that had traveled across an ocean in the hope of a better life? That's impossible, I whispered. It's documented, Richard replied, pulling out his phone and showing me photos of similar pieces in museums and private collections. Your grandmother Lucia had exceptional taste. She brought a treasure to America, and it's been hiding in plain sight in your living room for a century. I thought about Kevin pricing it at $300, calling it junk, ready to let some stranger haul it away for practically nothing. I thought about how close I'd come to losing not just this desk but everything I owned because my grandson saw me as an obstacle to his inheritance rather than a person worthy of dignity and care. What happens now? I asked. Richard Thornhill packed his documents back into his briefcase. Now we restore your life, Dorothy. We get your accounts back in your name, we track down the people who bought your things today and retrieve what we can, and we make sure you have the legal protections in place so nothing like this can ever happen again. And if you want, we can discuss having the desk properly authenticated and potentially sold. $2 million would ensure you live very comfortably for the rest of your life, with plenty left over to pass on to people who actually deserve it. Not Kevin, I said firmly. Definitely not Kevin, he agreed. But there must be other people in your life who've shown you real love and care. Your friend Patricia, for one. She's the reason I'm here. Patricia. My dear friend who'd listened to my fears and actually done something about it instead of just offering sympathy. Who'd seen what was happening and found someone who could help stop it. Who'd proven that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up when you need them most. What about my son Marco? I asked. Does he know what Kevin was doing? Richard shook his head. I haven't contacted him yet. I wanted to speak with you first about how you want to handle family communications. But Dorothy, if your son was unaware of his son's actions, he deserves to know. And if he was aware and did nothing, well, that's information you need to have too. I nodded slowly, exhaustion finally catching up with me. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was fading, leaving me shaky and overwhelmed. But beneath the exhaustion was something else, something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Can I stay here? I asked. In my house? Or will there be legal problems because of the power of attorney? You can absolutely stay here, Richard assured me. This is your home, Dorothy. Kevin never had the legal right to sell it or force you to leave. The power of attorney he obtained was fraudulent from the start, because it was based on misrepresentations about your mental capacity. Any judge will see that within 5 minutes of talking to you. I looked around my living room, at the empty spaces where my possessions had been before Kevin's sale, at the writing desk standing proud in the corner, at the home Vincent and I had built together. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more conversations, more legal processes to undo the damage Kevin had done. But tonight I was still here, still standing, still fighting. And I had just discovered that the desk my grandmother had carried across an ocean, the simple piece of furniture that represented our family's journey from poverty in Naples to prosperity in Boston, was worth more than Kevin could have imagined in his greediest dreams. There was a poetry in that, a sense of justice that felt almost divine. My grandmother Lucia had worked herself to exhaustion in a textile factory to give her children a better life. She'd saved every penny, sacrificed everything, believed in the promise of America even when that promise seemed impossibly far away. And somehow, in choosing this one beautiful desk to bring with her, she'd ensured that her great-granddaughter would be protected from a predatory great-great-grandson nearly a century later. "Thank you," I said to Richard Thornhill, meaning it with every fiber of my being. "You saved my life today." He stood and extended his hand. "Your friend Patricia saved your life by making that call. I just did my job. But Dorothy, you saved yourself by keeping that journal, by staying mentally sharp enough to document what was happening, by refusing to accept your grandson's version of reality. A lot of people in your situation give up, let themselves be convinced that they're too old or too sick to fight back. You didn't do that." After he left with promises to be in touch the next day with next steps, I sat alone in my living room as twilight gathered outside the windows. The house felt different now, quieter but also somehow lighter, like a weight had been lifted from its walls along with Kevin's presence. I walked over to the writing desk and ran my hand along its surface the way Richard Thornhill had, feeling the smooth wood that countless hands had touched over 239 years. I opened the small drawers, seeing my grandmother's tiny handwriting still visible on the paper lining the bottom of one compartment. A shopping list from 1952. Eggs, flour, olive oil, bread. $2 million. The phrase kept running through my mind like an impossible dream. But it wasn't about the money, not really. It was about what that value represented, validation that my family's history mattered, that our stories and struggles and tiny everyday acts of love had worth beyond measure. Kevin had seen junk where there was treasure, had seen burden where there was heritage, had seen an obstacle where there was a human being who'd loved him unconditionally. He'd lost more than $2 million today. He'd lost the chance to be part of something meaningful, to be connected to a history that stretched back centuries and forward into a future he'd never be part of now. He'd traded all of that for immediate gratification and easy money, and in doing so, he'd revealed exactly what kind of man he'd chosen to become. I thought about calling Marco but decided it could wait until tomorrow. Tonight was for breathing, for being present in my own home without fear, for beginning to imagine a future that I controlled. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations with my son about what his son had done. It would bring the process of tracking down my sold possessions and explaining to strangers that they'd inadvertently purchased stolen goods. It would bring lawyers and paperwork and all the tedious work of undoing Kevin's betrayal. But tomorrow would also bring the possibility of justice, of restoration, of a life rebuilt on my own terms with resources I'd never imagined having. $2 million could do more than just secure my comfort. It could create scholarships in Vincent's name, support the food pantry where I'd volunteered, help other elderly people trapped in situations like mine. It could become a legacy of generosity instead of greed, of love instead of exploitation. I made myself a simple dinner, soup and bread at the kitchen table where Vincent and I had shared so many meals. I pretended he was sitting across from me, telling him about the impossible day I'd had, imagining what he would say. He'd always been protective of me, always believed I was stronger than I gave myself credit for. I thought he'd be proud of how I'd handled myself today, proud that I'd fought back instead of accepting defeat. As darkness fell completely, I found myself thinking about Kevin as a child, trying to reconcile the laughing boy who'd helped me in the garden with the cruel stranger who tried to steal everything I owned. Where had it gone wrong? Had he always been capable of this kind of callousness, Or had something happened to twist him into someone who could look at his own grandmother and see only dollars and inconvenience? I probably never know the answer to that question. Some people would say I should feel sorry for him, that I should try to understand what drove him to such betrayal. But I was too tired for pity tonight, too raw from being treated like garbage in my own home. Maybe someday I'd be able to feel something other than anger and hurt when I thought about Kevin. But that day wasn't today. The writing desk gleamed softly in the lamplight, its carved details casting intricate shadows on the wall. I imagined my grandmother Lucia polishing it in her small apartment in Naples, carefully wrapping it for the long voyage to America, setting it up in whatever tiny space she could afford in the crowded tenements of Boston's North End. She'd probably never imagined that this desk would still be in the family 100 years later, still telling the story of immigrant dreams and stubborn survival. And she certainly never could have imagined that her great-granddaughter would discover its astronomical value on the same day. Her great-great-grandson tried to sell it for $300 at a junk sale. Life had a dark sense of humor sometimes, revealing treasures and truths in the same devastating moment. I stayed up late into the night, too wired to sleep, processing everything that had happened. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I made my way upstairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Vincent. As I lay in our bed, staring at the ceiling the way I had the night before Kevin's sale, everything felt different. The fear that had kept me awake then was gone, replaced by a tentative hope and the strange lightness that comes from surviving something you weren't sure you'd make it through. Tomorrow would begin the next chapter of this story, whatever that turned out to be. But tonight, I was simply Dorothy Castellano, 73 years old, lying in my own bed in my own house with a $2 million antique in my living room and a grandson who would never darken my door again. It wasn't the life I'd planned or the family story I'd hoped to be living, but it was mine, and I was still here to tell it. Morning came with sunlight streaming through the bedroom windows, and for the first time in months, I woke without that immediate sense of dread. The events of yesterday felt surreal in the gentle morning light, like maybe I'd dreamed the whole impossible confrontation. But then I heard movement downstairs and remembered that Richard Thornhill had arranged for a security specialist to change all my locks first thing in the morning. Kevin no longer had access to my home, and the physical reality of new keys being cut made everything feel startlingly real. I dressed slowly, my body still weak from months of stress layered on top of recovering from pneumonia. The woman in the mirror looked older than I remembered, thinner, with worry lines etched deeper than they'd been a year ago. But there was something different in my eyes now, a spark that Kevin's cruelty hadn't managed to extinguish. I was still here, still fighting, still standing in my own bedroom getting ready to face whatever came next. Downstairs, the locksmith was finishing up the back door while Richard Thornhill sat at my kitchen table with an open laptop and several folders spread across the surface. He looked up when I entered and smiled warmly. "Good morning, Dorothy. I hope you managed to get some sleep. I took the liberty of making coffee. I hope you don't mind." "I don't mind at all," I said, accepting the cup he poured for me. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what I needed. "What happens today?" Richard gestured to the chair across from him. "Today we start putting your life back together. I've already filed emergency motions with the probate court to revoke the power of attorney and freeze all accounts Kevin has accessed. I have a meeting with your bank at 10 o'clock to begin the process of restoring your access and tracking exactly where your money went. And I've contacted the estate sale company that Kevin hired to get a list of everyone who purchased items yesterday." The mention of my sold possessions made my stomach clench. "Can we really get everything back?" "Most of it, yes. Estate sales leave paper trails. Everyone who bought something signed a receipt. We'll contact each buyer, explain the situation, and offer to refund their purchases plus a reasonable amount for their inconvenience. Most people will cooperate once they understand they inadvertently purchased stolen property. The few who don't will face legal consequences." I sipped my coffee, trying to process the efficiency with which Richard was dismantling Kevin's scheme. This must be expensive. I don't know how much I can afford for legal fees right now, especially if Kevin drained my accounts. Richard closed his laptop and looked at me with an expression that was both professional and genuinely kind. "Dorothy, your friend Patricia has already covered my retainer. She insisted. And once we recover your assets and potentially auction the Maggiolini desk, you'll have more than enough resources to handle any expenses." But I want you to understand something important. Cases like yours, elder abuse situations where family members exploit vulnerable people, these are cases I take personally. My own grandmother went through something similar before she passed. I couldn't help her because I didn't know what was happening until it was too late. So when Patricia called me about your situation, there was no question that I'd take the case. The generosity of it overwhelmed me for a moment. Patricia, who had her own financial worries after her husband's medical bills, had paid for a lawyer she couldn't really afford because she cared about me. And this man, this stranger who'd walked into my living room yesterday like an avenging angel, was driven by his own family's tragedy to help mine. I need to call Patricia, I said. I need to thank her. She's coming by this afternoon, Richard replied. She wanted to give you the morning to rest and deal with the immediate legal matters, but she's been worried sick about you. The locksmith finished his work and presented me with 3 shiny new keys. Kevin's keys would no longer open my doors. It was such a simple thing, replacing locks, but it felt monumental. My home was mine again, protected against the person who tried to steal it from me. After the locksmith left, Richard and I went through the documentation he'd compiled over the past 2 weeks. The extent of Kevin's theft was staggering. He'd transferred over $60,000 from my savings account into accounts he controlled. He'd cashed my Social Security checks for 3 months. He'd even taken out a credit card in my name and run up $15,000 in charges for electronics, clothes, and luxury items. The total damage was close to $90,000, not counting the value of the items he'd sold at the estate sale. How did he think he'd get away with this? I asked, staring at the spreadsheet Richard had created tracking every fraudulent transaction. He was counting on you being too sick, too confused, or too intimidated to fight back, Richard said. And if that didn't work, he was planning to have you declared incompetent and institutionalized. I found communications between Kevin and a residential care facility, inquiring about costs for long-term memory care patients. He was setting up a narrative that you needed to be put away for your own safety. The coldness of it stole my breath. Kevin had been planning to lock me away in a facility, strip me of my independence and dignity, all so he could freely plunder everything Vincent and I had worked for. How does someone become capable of that kind of calculated cruelty toward their own grandmother? There's something else you need to know, Richard continued, his expression growing more serious. I ran a background check on Kevin as part of my investigation. He has significant gambling debts. Over $200,000 owed to various online betting sites and at least 1 loan shark. That's what was driving this, Dorothy. He needed money fast, and you were the easiest target. Gambling debts. Of course. That explained the desperation, the speed with which he'd moved once I was in the hospital, the willingness to burn every family bridge to get what he needed. Kevin hadn't just betrayed me out of casual greed. He'd been running from something, and he decided that stealing from his grandmother was preferable to facing the consequences of his own choices. What about his father? I asked. Does Marco know about the gambling? I don't know yet, Richard admitted. That's a conversation we need to have today. Your son deserves to know what his son did to you, and we need to find out if he had any knowledge of or involvement in Kevin's scheme. The thought of facing Marco made my chest tight with anxiety. My relationship with my son had always been complicated, made more so after Rachel left and Marco threw himself into his work to avoid dealing with the pain. We'd grown distant over the past few years, speaking mostly on holidays and birthdays, our conversations polite but surface level. He knew I'd been in the hospital, but Kevin had assured him I was recovering fine and being well cared for. Had Marco been willfully blind to what was really happening, or had Kevin lied to him the way he'd lied to everyone else? Richard drove me to the bank at 10, and the meeting with the branch manager was both vindicating and humiliating. The manager, a nervous young man named Timothy Chun, seemed genuinely horrified as Richard laid out the evidence of fraud and elder abuse. Mrs. Castellano, I'm so sorry this happened, Timothy said, his hands shaking slightly as he reviewed the account records. Kevin presented documentation showing power of attorney and medical statements about your cognitive decline. We followed our protocols, but clearly we should have verified the information more thoroughly. Your protocols allowed a predator to steal nearly $100,000 from a vulnerable client, Richard said coolly. We'll be discussing the bank's liability in this matter, once Mrs. Castellano's accounts are restored. Timothy went pale. Of course, absolutely. I'll personally oversee the investigation and reversal of all unauthorized transactions. Mrs. Castellano, we're freezing Kevin's access immediately, and any accounts he created using your information will be closed and the funds returned to you. It took 2 hours to sort through everything. I had to sign dozens of forms, verify my identity multiple times, and answer questions about transactions I didn't even know had occurred. By the end of it, my head was pounding and my hand cramped from signing my name so many times. But when Timothy finally handed me new bank cards and confirmed that my accounts were secured and under my control alone, I felt another piece of my life click back into place. We returned to my house just before noon, and Patricia was waiting on the front porch with a casserole dish in her hands. The moment I saw her, tears I'd been holding back all morning finally broke free. She set down the casserole and pulled me into a fierce hug. "Oh, Dorothy," she murmured. "I'm so glad you're okay. I've been so worried." "You saved me," I said into her shoulder. "If you hadn't called Mr. Thornhill, Kevin would have succeeded. I'd be in some facility right now, probably sedated and helpless, while he sold everything Vincent and I built." Patricia pulled back and gripped my shoulders, her own eyes wet. "That boy should be ashamed of himself. When you told me what he was doing, I couldn't believe it. I've known Kevin since he was small. I never thought he'd be capable of something so vicious." We went inside, and Patricia insisted on heating up the casserole while Richard made more coffee. It felt surreal, sitting in my kitchen with these two people who'd come to my rescue, eating Patricia's excellent chicken and rice while we discussed the legal dismantling of my grandson's theft operation. But it also felt like the first normal meal I'd had in months, surrounded by people who actually cared about my well-being instead of seeing me as an obstacle to overcome. Richard's phone rang while we were eating, and he excused himself to take the call in the living room. When he returned, his expression was troubled. "That was Marco," he said. "Your son. He's on his way over. Apparently Kevin called him this morning with his version of yesterday's events, and Marco wants to hear the truth directly from you." My stomach dropped. I wasn't ready for this conversation, wasn't ready to see whatever expression would be on my son's face when he learned what his son had done. But ready or not, Marco was coming, and the confrontation I'd been dreading was about to happen. He arrived 20 minutes later, and I heard his truck pull into the driveway with the same distinctive engine rumble it had always had. Marco was a big man, built like Vincent had been in his prime, with the same broad shoulders and capable hands. He'd been working construction since he was 18, building other people's homes while his own family fell apart around him. When he walked through my door, he looked exhausted and angry and confused all at once. "Ma," he said, and just that one word carried so much weight. He saw Patricia and Richard and nodded to them, but his attention was fixed on me. "Kevin called me this morning. He said some lawyer accused him of stealing from you, that you turned on him after everything he did to help you. He was crying, Ma. He said you were being manipulated, that this guy was trying to take advantage of you. Tell me what's really going on." I gestured to the chair next to me. "Sit down, Marco. This is going to take a while." He sat and I told him everything. I told him about waking up in the hospital to find Kevin waiting with papers to sign. I told him about the power of attorney I'd thought was temporary medical authorization. I told him about watching my savings disappear, about being systematically cut off from my own finances, about Kevin's comments regarding selling the house and putting me in assisted living. I told him about the estate sale, about standing in my own kitchen watching strangers buy my life for pennies while Kevin laughed about grandma's junk. Marco's face went through a progression of emotions as I spoke. Confusion gave way to disbelief, then slowly, horribly, to recognition. He'd seen pieces of what was happening but had dismissed them or rationalized them away, and now he was being forced to see the whole ugly picture. "The desk," I said finally. "Kevin tried to sell your great-great-grandmother's writing desk for $300. The desk that came from Italy. That's been in our family for generations." Richard stopped him just in time. Richard pulled out his tablet and showed Marco the documentation about the Maggiolini desk, the provenance, the comparable sales, the estimated value of $2 million. My son stared at the screen like it was written in a language he couldn't comprehend. $2 million, he repeated numbly. For Nana Lucia's desk. Kevin called it junk. I said, and my voice cracked on the word. He called everything I own junk, Marco. He treated me like I was already dead and he was just clearing out an estate. Your son made me feel worthless in my own home. Marco's hands clenched into fists on the table. The gambling, he said quietly. That's what this was about. Kevin owes money. A lot of money. He came to me 6 months ago asking for a loan, $40,000. Said it was for a business opportunity. I told him I didn't have that kind of cash and he got angry, said I was selfish, said I didn't care about family. We haven't really talked since then. The pieces were falling into place. Kevin had tried to get money from his father first, been refused, and then had turned to the easier target. His sick, elderly grandmother who loved him and would sign papers she didn't understand if he framed it as helping her. Did you know what he was doing to Ma? Patricia asked, her voice sharp. Marco had always been a little afraid of Patricia, who'd been friends with his mother before I'd even met Vincent. She had a way of looking at you that made you feel about 6 years old and caught doing something you shouldn't. No, Marco said firmly, meeting her gaze. I swear I didn't know. Kevin told me he was helping Ma after she got out of the hospital. He said she needed someone to manage things while she recovered, that she'd asked him to handle her finances temporarily. I thought he was actually being a good grandson for once. And you didn't think to check on me yourself? I asked, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. You didn't think to call or visit to see how I was doing? Marco's face crumpled. I did call Ma. 3 or 4 times. Kevin always answered your phone. He said you were resting, that you got tired easily, that it was better not to disturb you. He said he was taking good care of you and you'd call me back when you felt stronger. Another manipulation. Kevin had intercepted my phone calls, isolated me from my son, controlled the narrative so nobody questioned what he was doing. And Marco had believed him because it was easier than pushing back. Easier than dealing with the complicated reality of an aging mother and a troubled son. I'm sorry, Marco said, and he was crying now, this big tough man who'd built houses with his bare hands reduced to tears in my kitchen. I should have come by anyway. I should have checked on you myself instead of taking Kevin's word for it. I failed you, Ma. Just like I failed in my marriage, just like I've been failing at being a father. I'm so sorry. I reached across the table and took his hand. It was calloused and scarred from years of construction work, but it was still my son's hand, still connected to the boy I'd raised and loved. Kevin is responsible for what Kevin did, I said. Not you. He made choices, terrible choices, and he'll face the consequences. But Marco, I need to know. Are you going to stand with your son or with your mother? Because you can't do both anymore. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. Marco looked at Richard, at Patricia, then back at me. I could see him wrestling with loyalties, with the primal urge to defend his child against all threats, even when that child was clearly in the wrong. I stand with you, Ma, he said finally. What Kevin did is unforgivable. I don't know how he became someone who could do this, but I can't defend it and I won't try to. You're my mother. You raised me, you loved me, you've been there for me my whole life. Kevin is my son, but he's also an adult who made adult choices. If he needs to face consequences, then that's what needs to happen. Relief flooded through me so intensely I felt dizzy. I'd been so afraid that this would drive a final wedge between Marco and me, that I'd lose my son along with my grandson. But he'd chosen right. He'd chosen truth and justice over blind family loyalty. Richard cleared his throat. Marco, I need to be clear about something. Kevin's actions constitute criminal elder abuse under Massachusetts law. Mrs. Castellano has grounds to press charges, which could result in your son facing jail time. She also has grounds for civil lawsuits to recover damages. How you handle your relationship with Kevin going forward is your business, but you should understand that his legal situation is serious. Marco nodded slowly. Will he really go to jail? That depends on several factors, Richard said. If he returns all the money he stole, cooperates fully with restoring your mother's property, and shows genuine remorse, the district attorney might be willing to negotiate a plea deal with probation instead of incarceration. But if he fights it, if he continues to claim he was helping rather than stealing, then yes, he'll likely face significant prison time. He needs to return the money, Marco said. However he does it, whatever he has to do. Even if he has to declare bankruptcy to get out from under the gambling debts. Ma deserves to have her money back, and Kevin needs to face what he's done. We spent the next hour discussing logistics. Richard explained the process of retrieving the sold items, the timeline for recovering my assets, the steps Kevin would need to take to avoid prosecution. Marco listened with his head in his hands, occasionally asking questions, clearly devastated by his son's betrayal, but trying to focus on practical solutions. Patricia had been quiet through most of this, but now she spoke up. Dorothy, what are you going to do about the desk? Are you going to sell it? I looked toward the living room where my grandmother's writing desk stood in the corner, exactly where it had been for 40 years. $2 million. The phrase still felt unreal. That money could change my life, could provide security I'd never imagined having. It could also become the tangible symbol of Kevin's greed, the thing he'd almost stolen that would now fund the rest of my life without him. I don't know yet, I said honestly. Part of me wants to keep it, to honor Nana Lucia's memory by preserving what she brought from the old country. But another part of me thinks she'd want me to use it, to turn it into something that could help people and do good in the world. You don't have to decide today, Richard said. First we need to have it officially authenticated and appraised, which will take a few weeks. That will give you time to think about what feels right. The afternoon wore on with more practical discussions. Patricia eventually left with promises to check on me daily and bring more food. Marco stayed until early evening, and before he left, he pulled me into a hug that reminded me of when he was young and would come to me with his problems, believing I could fix anything. I'm going to talk to Kevin, he said. I'm going to try to make him understand what he needs to do. I can't promise he'll listen, but I have to try. Be careful, I warned. He's desperate, and desperate people can be dangerous. After Marco left, Richard and I discussed the plan for the coming days. Tomorrow we'd start contacting the estate sale buyers. The day after, we had an appointment with Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a geriatric specialist who would conduct a comprehensive evaluation to document my mental competency. It wasn't strictly necessary since Kevin's power of attorney was already revoked, but Richard wanted ironclad evidence in case Kevin tried to challenge anything in court. How are you holding up? Richard asked as he was preparing to leave for the evening. This has been an intense 2 days. I'm tired, I admitted. Exhausted, really? But I also feel more alive than I have in months. Is that strange? He smiled. Not strange at all. You've been living under threat for so long that even exhaustion feels better than that constant fear. But Dorothy, I want you to be prepared for something. When we start retrieving your property and Kevin realizes how thoroughly his scheme has collapsed, he may escalate. He may try to contact you, threaten you, or spread lies about you to other family members. We have the restraining order in place, but pieces of paper don't always stop desperate people. What should I do if he shows up here? Call 911 immediately, then call me. Don't engage with him, don't try to reason with him. He's already proven he's willing to exploit your vulnerabilities. Promise me you'll be careful. I promised, and after Richard left, I found myself alone in my house for the first time since this whole nightmare began. The silence was different now. Not oppressive but peaceful. I walked through the rooms, touching furniture that was still mine, looking at photos that hadn't been sold, standing in the doorway of the bedroom where Vincent and I had slept for 4 decades. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The day after that would bring more. But tonight I was Dorothy Castellano, still standing in her own home, still fighting for her dignity, still believing that justice was possible even when family betrayed you. I made myself dinner and ate it at the kitchen table while darkness gathered outside. Then I walked into the living room and stood in front of Nana Lucia's writing desk. I opened each small drawer, touched the carved details, ran my fingers over the smooth surface that had survived 2 centuries and an ocean crossing. Thank you, I whispered to my grandmother, wherever her spirit might be. Thank you for bringing this with you. Thank you for holding on to it through poverty and hardship. Thank you for passing it down through the generations, so it could save me when I needed it most. The desk didn't answer, of course, but in the lamplight its would seem to glow with warmth, and I felt a connection to all the women in my family who'd sat at this desk before me. Women who'd faced their own hardships and survived. Women who'd crossed oceans and learned new languages and built lives in a foreign land through sheer determination and faith. I was their descendant, their legacy. And I would not let Kevin's cruelty be the end of that story. I would survive this just as they'd survive their trials. I would come through the fire stronger, wiser, and still capable of hope. That night, I slept better than I had in months. No nightmares about being dragged away to facilities against my will. No anxiety dreams about strangers dismantling my home. Just deep, restorative sleep in my own bed, in my own house, with new locks on the doors and a $2 million desk standing guard in the living room below. The next morning, Richard arrived early with a list of estate sale buyers and a plan for retrieving my property. We started with the items that were most valuable or most sentimental: the carved wooden crucifix from the restaurant, Vincent's cookbook collection, my wedding dress, the hand-painted dishes from Sicily. Richard made phone calls while I waited, explaining the situation with professional courtesy and offering generous refunds. Most people were understanding once they heard that they'd inadvertently purchased stolen property from an elder abuse situation. A few were resistant, arguing that they'd bought the items in good faith and shouldn't have to return them. For those cases, Richard's tone grew steelier, and he explained the legal consequences of knowingly retaining stolen goods. That usually resolved the resistance quickly. By mid-afternoon, items were starting to return. A young couple brought back the dishes, apologetic and horrified when they learned what had really happened. An older gentleman returned Vincent's toolbox, refusing the refund Richard offered and insisting that such items belonged with family. A woman brought my wedding dress back in its preservation box, handling it with such care that I could tell she understood exactly what it meant. Each item that came home felt like a small victory, a piece of my life restored. But there were losses too. Some buyers couldn't be located. A few items had already been resold or given away. Vincent's favorite armchair, the one where he'd read to me on countless evenings, had been bought by someone who'd immediately donated it to a charity shop. We tracked it down eventually, but only after it had been reupholstered and was no longer quite the same. Marco came by in the evening with news about Kevin. He'd met his son at a coffee shop, neutral territory, and had confronted him with everything Richard had uncovered. According to Marco, Kevin had gone through several emotional stages: denial first, then anger, then desperate pleading, before finally collapsing into what might have been genuine remorse. He says he wants to make it right, Marco told me, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. He says he'll return the money, all of it. He's talking to someone about a payment plan for his gambling debts, some kind of consolidation loan. He wants to know if there's any way you'd consider not pressing charges. I looked at my son's tired face and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Kevin deserved to face consequences for what he'd done. He'd stolen from me, lied about me, humiliated me, and came terrifyingly close to destroying my life. Criminal prosecution felt like appropriate justice. But I was also 73 years old, tired, and increasingly aware of how much energy it would take to see a criminal case through to conclusion. Trials, testimony, facing Kevin in court while he or his lawyer tried to paint me as confused or vindictive. Did I have the strength for that battle? Did I even want to? If he returns every penny, I said slowly, if he signs documents acknowledging what he did and agreeing to stay away from me permanently, if he gets help for his gambling addiction and proves he's serious about changing, then I'll consider not filing criminal charges. But Marco, if he fails to follow through on any of that, if he tries to manipulate this situation one more time, I won't hesitate. Do you understand? Marco nodded. I'll make sure he understands. Ma, I know you're being more generous than he deserves. I know that. I'm not being generous, I corrected. I'm being practical. Criminal prosecution is expensive and exhausting. If Kevin can make full financial restitution and remove himself from my life permanently, that accomplishes what I need without dragging this through the courts for years. But make no mistake, this isn't forgiveness. This is just choosing my battles carefully. Over the next week, a strange routine developed. Richard would arrive each morning with updates on the financial recovery and property retrieval. Items continued to return to my house, slowly filling the empty spaces Kevin's sale had created. The bank completed its investigation and restored nearly $80,000 that they could definitively trace as fraudulent transfers. The rest would take longer to recover, but Richard was optimistic we'd eventually get it all back. Dr. Warren conducted her evaluation, 3 sessions of comprehensive testing that left me mentally exhausted but also validated. Her report stated unequivocally that I possess full mental capacity, that I showed no signs of cognitive impairment beyond normal age-related changes, and that any claims to the contrary were unsupported by medical evidence. Richard filed the report with the probate court, creating an official record that Kevin's justifications for taking power of attorney had been fabricated. Marco came by almost daily, sometimes just to check on me, sometimes to help with tasks around the house that were difficult for me to do alone. We were slowly rebuilding our relationship, learning to talk to each other again after years of polite distance. He told me about his loneliness after Rachel left, about throwing himself into work to avoid dealing with his feelings, about his guilt over not being a better father to Kevin. I told him about my struggles with aging, with feeling invisible and discounted, with the fear I'd felt watching my independence slip away. These conversations were painful but necessary. We were excavating years of misunderstanding and hurt, bringing them into the light where they could be examined and hopefully healed. It wasn't quick or easy, but it was real in a way our relationship hadn't been for a long time. Patricia continued to be my anchor, bringing meals, accompanying me to appointments, sitting with me in the evenings when the house felt too quiet. She'd been recently widowed herself, and we found comfort in each other's company. Two women who'd loved deeply and lost much, trying to figure out how to build new lives from the ruins of old ones. Kevin transferred the first payment, $15,000, into my restored bank account. Then another $10,000 a week later. He was apparently liquidating his assets, selling everything he'd bought with my stolen money. Marco reported that his son had entered a Gamblers Anonymous program and seemed genuinely committed to recovery, but I remained skeptical. Addiction was powerful, and Kevin had proven himself capable of elaborate deception. Time would tell if this change was real or just another manipulation. The most significant development came 2 weeks after Richard had first walked into my living room. Dr. Harrison Mitchell arrived from the auction house, one of the world's leading experts on Italian neoclassical furniture. He spent an entire day examining Nana Lucia's writing desk, taking measurements, analyzing the wood and joinery, comparing details to documented Maggiolini pieces, running tests on the varnish and inlays. When he finished, his face was flushed with excitement. "Mrs. Castellano," he said, carefully setting down his magnifying glass. "This is an extraordinary find. I've authenticated 41 Maggiolini pieces in my career, and this is among the finest I've ever seen. The provenance from your family's documentation, combined with the distinctive marquetry style and construction techniques, leaves no doubt about its authenticity." "And the value?" Richard asked. Dr. Mitchell consulted his notes. Conservative auction estimate would be 1.8 to 2.2 million. In the right sale with the right buyers, it could go even higher. There's a private collector in Switzerland who's been trying to acquire a Maggiolini desk for 15 years. I suspect he'd be very interested. $2 million. The estimate Richard had given me was confirmed. My grandmother's desk, the simple piece of furniture that had sat in my living room for 40 years, was worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Kevin had been minutes away from selling it to a stranger for $300. "What do I do now?" I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of the decision. Dr. Mitchell pulled out a folder with auction house materials. "That's entirely up to you, Mrs. Castellano. You could consign it to auction, which would likely achieve the highest price but takes time and involves fees. You could sell it privately, which is faster but might bring slightly less money. Or you could keep it. Some things are worth more than their market value." After Dr. Mitchell left, Richard and I sat in my living room staring at the desk that had suddenly transformed from family heirloom to multimillion-dollar asset. The implications were staggering. With that kind of money, I could live comfortably for the rest of my life. I could help Marco, help Patricia, help other elderly people trapped in situations like mine. I could establish something permanent, a legacy that would outlast me. But I would also be selling the last physical connection to my grandmother, the woman who'd courageously left everything she knew to build a better life in America. The woman whose determination and faith had echoed down through 4 generations to save me from her great-great-grandson's greed. "I need time to think," I told Richard. "Of course," he agreed. "This isn't a decision to rush. The desk has survived for over 2 centuries. It can wait a few more weeks while you figure out what feels right." That evening I sat alone with the desk, opening drawers, touching surfaces, trying to feel what Nana Lucia would want me to do. My grandmother had been practical above all else. She'd worked brutal hours in dangerous conditions to provide for her family. She'd made hard choices, left behind people and places she loved, adapted to a new language and culture, all for the sake of survival and opportunity. I thought she'd understand if I sold the desk. I thought she'd approve of turning her beautiful piece of furniture into resources that could protect and help the family she'd fought so hard to establish. The desk itself wasn't sacred. What was sacred was the love and determination it represented, and that would survive regardless of whether I kept or sold the physical object. Still, I couldn't quite bring myself to commit to selling it. Not yet. Maybe in a few weeks, after more time had passed and the emotional upheaval had settled. Maybe then I'd be ready to let it go and transform it into something new. For now, it stood in my living room as both memorial and guardian. Nana Lucia's gift reaching across time to save me from a danger she never could have imagined. And every time I looked at it, I remembered that I came from strong women who'd survived impossible things. That strength lived in me too, and it had been enough to get me through Kevin's betrayal. Whatever I decided about the desk's future, that truth would remain. The month that followed brought a strange kind of peace. Kevin continued making payments, slowly returning the money he'd stolen. The estate sale items continued trickling back, my house gradually looking more like home again. My strength continued to improve, my body finally healing from the pneumonia now that I wasn't under constant stress. I started volunteering at the food pantry again, started tending my garden, started living instead of just surviving. But underneath that peace, I knew the story wasn't finished yet. Kevin's payments would take months to complete. The decision about the desk still loomed. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that my grandson's apparent repentance was too convenient, too perfectly timed. He was saying all the right things, making all the right gestures, but was any of it real? Marco believed Kevin was genuine or wanted to believe it anyway. Patricia remained skeptical. Richard maintained professional neutrality, but made sure I knew that the restraining order remained in effect regardless of Kevin's payments. The law provided a boundary that my grandson wasn't allowed to cross, no matter how reformed he claimed to be. And me? I didn't know what to believe. I wanted to think that people could change, that even someone who'd done terrible things could recognize their mistakes and become better. But I'd also learned that trust, once shattered, was nearly impossible to fully restore. Kevin would have to prove himself over years, not weeks, before I'd be willing to believe in his transformation. For now, I focused on my own healing and rebuilding. The rest would unfold as it was meant to, and I would be ready for whatever came next. I'd survived the worst Kevin could do to me. I'd fought back when fighting seemed impossible. I'd discovered reserves of strength I hadn't known I possessed. Whatever happened next, I would face it as Dorothy Castellano, survivor and fighter, great-granddaughter of Lucia who'd crossed an ocean with nothing but faith and a beautiful desk. That heritage lived in me, and it was worth more than all the money in the world. The story was far from over, but I was no longer afraid of how it might end. 6 months passed. Kevin completed his payments. The desk sold at auction for $2.4 million. I established a foundation in Vincent's name helping elderly abuse victims. Marco and I grew closer than we'd been in years. Patricia became family in ways blood never guaranteed. Kevin sent a letter apologizing, asking to meet. I declined. Some bridges once burned stay that way. The money secured my future and helped countless others. Nana Lucia's desk fulfilled its true purpose, protecting family across generations. I'm 74 now, living fully in the home Vincent and I built. Kevin's betrayal taught me that family is chosen through actions, not inherited through blood. I chose wisely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.